Today, we have a lecture on Chapter 15 Media Effects and Cultural Approaches to Research. As always, this lecture will make more sense if you've skimmed the chapter before watching the lecture. In this chapter, we're going to examine the evolution of media research, focus on two major strains of media research, investigating strengths and limitations of both, and consider how media research interacts with our democratic ideals. Scholars who think about media ask different kinds of questions, like how does the news impact people's behaviors or, say, their voting practices? How does popular media define what we consider to be normal? Or maybe how do our identities, whether that's gender, race, or class, sexuality, impact how we interact with media? These types of questions are just a few of the many types that media scholars might consider when thinking about how to study and better understand our media and communications landscape. And so today we're going to talk about different theories, and hopefully you'll see that some of the different kinds of questions connect to different types of theories and approaches to studying media in ways that you'll have probably seen throughout the semester. So, in early United States media and communications research, there was particularly a focus on political and moral arguments about media and technology. So, Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote the book Democracy in America, was particularly concerned about the morality of the news and politics and the ways that it was representative. Karl Marx, in his work Capital, was concerned with the ways industrialization and shifting technologies were transforming society. And so while Marx wasn't really discussing the media, his work about technology was really foundational for thinking about the ways that technologies interact with society and the effects that they have. And so this has implications for thinking about communications and later media. In the early 20th century, we start to see a greater interest in bringing scientific approaches to studying media. In the 20s and 30s, we see works like Walter Lippmann, Liberty in the News, and his other work, Public Opinion, start to form ideas about how we could study media and communication from methods developed within sciences. Harold Laswell, who we'll talk about a little bit more, was really important to understanding propaganda and how we relate to it. There are four kinds of main trends in early media research. This is between 1930 and 1960: propaganda analysis, public opinion research, social psychology studies, and marketing research. And many of these are in some form or another still part of how a lot of media studies is constructed, even if we've evolved away from a lot of these. And we'll talk a little bit more about how. So, propaganda analysis was primarily interested in how the media could be used by governments in this time, in particular, to sway public opinion in favor of war. Aslow's book on propaganda technique in World War I was one of the first to think about how to study propaganda so that it could be used specifically to influence society and their opinions about the war in a way that garnered support. So the government was hiring researchers, and this would go on to shape the techniques even post war. So Laszlo defines propaganda as the control of opinions by significant symbols. So things like stories, rumors, reports, pictures, and other forms of social communication. We can think about propaganda analysis as being interested in the study of direct manipulation of information for specific purposes. Later, we see an interest develop in something called public opinion research, which was seeking primarily to understand the different ways that mass media filtered information and shaped public attitude. So it goes hand in hand with propaganda in some ways, but it was developed to be distinct. Walter Lippmann, who was instrumental in that process, distrusted the public to function as knowledgeable citizens and also distrusted journalism's ability to help the public separate truth from lies. In promoting the place of the expert, Lippmann celebrated the social scientist as part of a new expert class that could best make unseen fact intelligible for those who have to make decisions. So, trying to assess public opinion through public opinion research was slightly different from propaganda because it was not necessarily invested in swaying opinion so much as it was trying to understand public opinion on a large scale. And so today we see groups like Pew Research and Gallup polls, which you'll hear very often in news or read about whenever you're looking at information about voter practices and things like that, that work to assess public opinion about topics that are of large political importance or social significance. Typically, while useful, there are many problems with these types of polling techniques. So, as we saw in the 2016 election, news outlets who have come to rely really heavily on public opinion research to assess polling data, for instance, made a lot of assumptions about how the election would turn out based on that data. When we see data presented in public opinion research, it's good to be aware that the methods used to assess public opinion often leave large parts of the population out, and so don't necessarily reflect people's actual actions or opinions. this has become based in self-reporting as well. So, for instance, one of the reasons that it became a situation around the 2016 election was because people who voted for one person might have reported that they had voted for someone else or not at all. So, public opinion research, which became popular in this period between the 1930s and 60s, is still really widely practiced today. But increasingly, we see some more and more difficulties with this kind of research. So, next we have social psychology. Social psychology research started to be used by researchers in order to measure the behavior and cognition of individuals and society as it relates to media. Early research, in particular, tried to see how violence in films impacted young people. From this research, we saw things that have made huge differences in the institutions invented in order to address these things. So, the Motion Picture Production Code, which rates films because of responses from social psychology studies, or things like TV parental guidelines and the video game rating system. Social psychology studies are really foundational to setting a lot of these different types of grading systems that we have in society that tie to media and form the suitability of media for different age groups. Finally, there's market research, which was originally gaining traction in the 1920s, but hit its stride in the 1960s, and it became a solidified method of research for media and communication. It was tied at that time specifically to the rise of advertising appearing in media, or when businesses started to use mass media more to reach consumers. So this comes up also with the rise of PR and other forms of communication that we've discussed in the past as well. This research is interested in determining consumer preferences and media use so that companies can target customers better, so that they can convince customers to purchase their goods or to engage with their products in some way. And today, obviously, we still see a ton of market research, and this is largely focused on online assessments of consumers and consumer data. And market research positions are very common as part of most media companies today. So this is also a lot of what's happening, by the way, when we're being surveyed through social media sites that we frequent, is we are part of large market research studies, often without our knowledge. From those early trends, we see three schools or major theories and approaches for studying media come out of them. Those three are media effects, cultural studies, and political economy approaches. So, for the rest of this lecture, I'm going to go through each of these schools of theory for studying media with some examples. First of these is media effects research. Media effects attempts to understand, explain, and predict the effects of mass media on individuals and society. It takes an administrative approach to studying media. What this means is that traditionally it uses large scale studies that primarily involve statistical or quantitative data and analysis. Quantitative, we'll talk about this a little bit more, differs from qualitative in that what we're interested in primarily for quantitative data is amassing a significant number of responses. And this often means the use of multiple choice survey style research or things that do not necessarily have open ended aspects where the subjects have the opportunity to talk to us and tell us what they think outside of the limited options that they're given. Also, this kind of research tends to be publicly funded by the government and or privately funded by large scale corporations. And as a result, it's not often taken on by individual scholars, but rather is again this kind of organizational research. And there can be some significant tensions with this aspect of media effects research because it's often funded by these agencies that people worry have a significant impact on the kind of study, the way that it's framed. When we change the way we frame a study, it delivers different results. Some early media effects research was referred to as the hypodermic needle model, also known as the magic bullet theory or the direct effects model. It's one of the earliest media effects theories. So, this theory suggested that the media shoot their effects directly into the vulnerable minds of audiences. And this assumes that this passive audience uncritically takes in anything that it's given. So, our little demonstration here of the media said it, therefore it must be true. And this sort of comes out of concerns over the influence of popular media like film and radio on society in the early 20th century, as we saw with even of the printing press, right? So these were deep anxieties about the effects of media. So a classic example of this would be, as we discussed earlier in the semester on our week on radio, the War of the Worlds broadcast. There is, of course, this story of what happened, that people maybe tuned in late to a fictional story about an alien invasion that they believed to be a news broadcast. And the idea is that this somehow caused this huge panic because people didn't understand and just took in the information uncritically and thought it was real. So people were thinking, as they were listening, there was actually this invasion happening. And people were worried that the media was too influential after this happened. However, a later study published in 1940 showed that this story of this kind of crisis response to the War of the Worlds broadcast was not correct, and that people hadn't really panicked. There were a few people who did, and those stories got picked up by media and then reshared, as we've talked about how the media reproduces stories over and over again that have shown to have traction in other places. And so since then, many types of research have tried to show that audiences' responses to media are far from that simple. So the hypodermic model is really not one that's particularly active today, although I would argue that it's not used in media studies research, but there's a lot of public opinion and fear that really is based on a kind of hypodermic needle model, right? That if something is told to enough people, they will simply believe it, regardless of their beliefs prior to it. The next model is called the minimal effects model or the limited model. And it argues that media alone doesn't influence people, but that also our opinions and behavior are factors that we bring into the way that we look at media and what we take from it. So it argues that people engage with media using what's referred to as selective exposure or selective retention. And selective exposure would mean you choose what you consume in relationship to what you already believe. And selective retention is that you only remember things that kind of maybe fit into or relate to things that you already have some relationship to. In other words, this model suggests that the media usually works to reinforce our existing beliefs and opinions rather than change them. So we're not necessarily going to believe something that seems totally outside of what we think is believable. So those studies that were done looking at how different the response to the War of the Worlds really was versus this story of mass panic was that the small group of people that was really deeply affected by it tended to be people who were already believers in large scale potential catastrophic events, who might be inclined to be thinking about things in terms of rapture or other kinds of narratives like that would be part of their belief system to begin with. So we might use this to see in media that the media is used to bolster people's already existing opinions. Many elements of this theory are still in practice today. Although later research has shown that this model is only useful on an individual level, right? We're not actually talking about large scale social effects when we think about this. And it doesn't really work well for understanding how media affects those large groups in society. So the model also assumes a pretty passive audience, although slightly more active than the last one. So while it acknowledges that people's opinions or behaviors might impact how they understand the media, it still suggests that we directly understand the media in the way that it was created. The most enduring models of media effects research, or at least one of them, comes from Harold Laswell and his 5-step model, which asks who says what, in which channel, to whom, and with what effect. And as you can see, this is still an incredibly top-down approach, and it doesn't necessarily give us a ton of space for thinking about audience responses or uses. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So this theory suggests that when we approach a type of media, these 5 questions will help us understand what's happening in terms of the effect of the media on an individual or potentially on society. And it gives us a process for what kinds of questions to ask. And so, who says what in which channel to whom and with what effect is a set of questions that a lot of media studies scholars still use. And then we might add other things onto that, like how do audiences respond, etc. But it's definitely still a really pervasive way of approaching. Okay, so we're going to go through a couple of examples using these more updated media effects models to think about some of these different kinds of advertisements that we've seen in recent years. So, this first example is the Just Do It campaign that was carried out by Nike featuring Colin Kaepernick just after he had been in the media quite a lot for kneeling for the national anthem in protest of police violence towards Black Americans and the NFL's silence on that. So if we're going to use a media effects model to understand how this advertisement impacts individuals or society, then we would want to go through those 5 questions that Laswell proposed. So who in this advertisement we could say is Nike, right? So that's who produces this. We could also say Colin Kaepernick, right? It's Nike, but it's also him, right? He's in the ad. So what is the ad saying? It says here, literally, believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything. So we can assume that's what it's saying if we take Laswell's model directly. And we can interpret that pretty literally to be about belief and about inspiration, about sacrifice for one's beliefs. So that might be what it's telling us to believe in things regardless of what it might cost us. Through what channel? We would say that this happens through a number of different channels because it's a tricky one, right? I put it on screen here, but it was also a billboard ad. It was on TV. It was part of commercials, but we could say it's a billboard for now, but it existed in many different channels. So that means that it's going to be seen in a particular way in spaces where we expect to see advertisement in particular. The channel is a billboard. So that means that large crowds are going to see it and understand it as an advertisement. To whom is it speaking? We could say to Nike customers, presumably people who already have a relationship with the brand. We could say to activists, and we could say maybe that it's talking to minority groups, as it represents a lot of struggle happening right then at the moment that this was produced over the movement for Black Lives. And he was trying to represent that movement in an arena where it wasn't really welcomed, right? In the NFL, there was a lot of pushback. And he ended up actually being relieved of his NFL contract. He was fired, so he wasn't playing. And so I'll answer that final question. So, with what effect, right? So, this ad is assumed to be an inspirational ad about belief. And so it intends, presumably, to inspire belief and motivate people to stand up for something they believe in. So, that's if we follow this exact process, if we follow from the presumed intentions and the direct communications in an advertisement, that's kind of where we land. So we should understand that the intended effect of this ad and the effect that it would have on people following a media effects lens of research are pretty close, right? So there's not a whole ton of difference between those. So this is an ad that primarily appeared in the UK for a protein brand, and the ad reads, "Are you Beachbody ready?" How would a media effects structure interpret this ad? So the person is not recognizable, so we're only going to think about the company as who is speaking, and what they're saying is, "Are you Beachbody ready?" So they're saying, "Are you prepared? Are you this?" Right? So the suggestion then is this, right? So they're asking the consumer questions about our bodies. In which channel, right? Again, this is another advertisement that would have been posted in many places, presumably in train stations and subways in particular, or in the UK. Similarly, actually, to the Nike ad, it existed in many places, but it would have been seen a lot in spaces where one expects to see advertisement. And then, so who is it addressed to? This gets to be a little bit of a trickier question, because on the one hand, we might assume that it's targeting women because a lot of ads that feature women are directed at women we talked about this in advertising, right? So if we think about insecurity models in advertising, this is something that's designed to speak specifically to the woman, right? This is a comparative structure, which we saw historically in advertising structures. However, we could also say that it might be intentionally speaking to men, because the assumption is a sort of heteronormative response that men look at women in advertising, and that's a way to sell things to men. So that can be a little tricky and a little less clear, especially as a protein shake. They might be suggesting men should be taking their protein shake and hitting the gym in order to potentially have the opportunity to be perceived as Beachbody ready by this woman, rather than a direct comparison. So then finally, we say, what's the effect of this ad? And I think this ad is perhaps to make us feel motivated to go to a gym to take their product. Presumably, they're selling a product. So the assumption here is that we should feel motivated to consume this protein powder or something from Protein World and relate to its call to be Beachbody ready in a particular way. So for our next step, we're going to look at some of the contemporary media effects theories that have grown out of these older models. So these would still in many ways use Laswell's model, but they'll shift us in slightly different directions. So the first of these is social learning theory, uses and gratifications theory, agenda setting, and cultivation effect. Social learning theory was popularized in the 1960s. And again, it's really one of those media effects theories that was devised in response to trying to understand the effects of media, particularly on violence in children. And so this is a very famous study that is a signifier, right, of social learning theory. This is the Bobo experiment, where children were shown images of violence towards this blow-up clown doll. Different groups of children were shown different things. So all of the children were then placed in a room with toys, and there was a demonstrable difference between the children who had seen those videos and who then also responded violently towards the Bobo doll and those who did not. So this process for social learning theory goes through a number of steps, right? The attention paid to a media, the retention of the message conveyed through the media, physical motor reproduction, right? Does one reproduce what they're seeing? And then finally, motivation. Supporters of social learning theory often cite real life limitations of media aggression as evidence of social learning theory at work, because they suggest, as the Bobo study does, that it's not just media that's in question, it's other relationships that are reinforcing those actions. Critics note, though, that many studies conclude just the opposite, that there's no link between media content and aggression at all. For example, millions of people have watched How to Get Away with Murder or Breaking Bad or any number of violent television shows or played violent video games and have not subsequently exhibited aggressive behavior. And these critics point out that social learning theory simply makes television, film, film and media and other kinds of video games into scapegoats or blames them for the violence in society that comes from other sources and social constructions. So next, we're going to talk about the uses and gratifications model. And this has become much more popular in recent years. And really what distinguishes it from other kinds of media effects is the fact that it's really interested in considering the choices and the action and the agency of the audience rather than seeing them as passive the way most other media effects models do. So researchers use this model to understand how people use media to satisfy various emotional or intellectual or social needs. And it shifts the question from what effect does the media have on us that we see as that fifth point of Laswell's question, right? To what do we do with media? How do we use it? So, for example, some argue that we use social networking sites like Facebook, Instagram, or TikTok because it gives us a way to express ourselves. That's a use, right? Even if we might not necessarily be content producers, something about the way that we can relate in those spaces or the communities that we can sense that we are a part of that we might not have access to in other ways feels to us in that moment incredibly significant. So that's a choice. That's a use that we make of a media that comes at us. So we like how it feels to receive likes or to respond to other people's engagements. That's also a gratification. So through thinking through why we use different forms of media, we can start to understand and outline different uses that people have for this media and the types of gratifications that they might get from that use. And this kind of spurs us towards continued use. So then these things also play into conversations around habit in media use. This model is seen as limited because it only addresses the function of media, not the larger social impact. Or when we get to what we'll talk about when we get to political economy, the systems in which it exists. This, just to give you a little history on this, uses and gratifications theory grew out of people trying to understand how people might use media in a way that was even counter to the way people expected. The most famous paper on this subject was by, I think, Jennifer Radwell. The idea was that they were studying why women read romance novels. And the assumption has always been, right, that it's sexist. It produces all of these old stereotypes, and what good is it really? And the uses and gratifications model argues that, like, the way that people were reading these things was to give themselves time and space away from other kinds of activities that they felt obligated to. And that was a satisfying engagement, right? So it challenges a lot of the assumptions about representation in content because it suggests that we can use media in a personal way that might actually challenge the assumptions we have about what the content in the media would be saying to us in a sort of more hypodermic model. Another theory that's come out of media effects is agenda setting. And agenda setting is the idea that mass media focuses attention on particular events or issues that they're setting the agenda for the topics of conversation at any given time in society. The short quote on this is the media can't tell you what to think, but it can tell you what to think about. So rather than a hypodermic model, which suggests that the media would somehow be able to tell you exactly what to think, this says it can't do that, but it can frame the agenda of the moment. And so there are two basic assumptions that underlie most research that comes out of agenda setting. The first is that the press and the media do not reflect reality, that they filter and shape it. And the second is that media concentration on a few issues or subjects needs the public to perceive those issues as more important than other issues. And that's how that sort of functions, right? So people who study agenda setting are primarily concerned with the ways that types of things that the media talk about set an agenda in society that works to define the media's reality and then also to some extent the reality of those who consume that media and then later affects how people perceive things. Next, we have the cultivation effect. Cultivation effect is concerned with the long-term effects of media. This theory also comes primarily out of TV studies and relationship to how we see violence. But in this instance, it's not that seeing violence makes us reproduce violence. What cultivation theory was interested in was how what we see changes the way we perceive the world. So it suggests that in the case of television, heavy viewers of television that tends to have various, say, catastrophic news stories or a lot of crime in fictionalized series, they start to see the world in a way that's consistent with what they see in the media. This is what George Gerbner referred to as the mean world theory, that the cultivation effect suggested that the more time individuals would spend viewing television, the more likely that those viewpoints would reflect these cultivated images and portrayals. So For Gerbner's study on mean world theory, for instance, he concluded that although fewer than 1% of Americans are victims of violent crime every year, the people who watch a lot of television tend to overestimate that percentage. So it's not just the effect of media on individuals, though, that cultivation studies is focused on, but on the broader societal perceptions of groups of people, places, cultures, etc. So researchers that study things from a cultivation effect perspective are concerned with how what we see in the media might impact our ideas about different groups. So if Gerbner demonstrates that if you watch a lot of violence through the news or through even fiction, you perceive there to be more violence in the world, then the extension of that is if the people enacting that violence on television or in the news are of a particular group, it will be more likely that you will come to believe that group has a greater instance of performing those actions that you're seeing. Spiral of silence theory proposes that those who believe that their views are in the minority based on what they see in media will keep their opinions to themselves. So this is an idea of thinking about how the media suggests a kind of consensus, that we perceive other people to be in consensus about certain things that we see on the media. So then if I'm watching a certain news program, if I'm watching a particular perspective that I don't necessarily share, they might be able to convince me that's everyone else's perspective and I'm sort of alone in my own. And the response to that is that those who perceive themselves to be in the minority from what they see in the media, the suggestion of spiral of silence is that those people then would keep silent, creating false ideas of what majority opinion really is. Again, we could think about this in terms of the polls that came out of the 2016 election. If a number of people presumed that the majority of people were voting one way, they might be inclined to say that they did too, even if that was not an accurate report of how they actually voted. So the spiral of silence theory also proposes that this kind of reinforces a false idea of what majority opinion is, and it doesn't suggest that all minority opinions fall silent. This is an important distinction. So just because it suggests that this is a typical response, it doesn't suggest that's always the way it is. In fact, many people don't. And there are groups that emerge that come out to be more vocal in response and resistance to the perception of the spiral of silence. They may still, however, get lost in the dominant narratives when that is reproduced for media again. Finally, wrapping up these sort of contemporary media effects theories is the third person effect, which was created by Phyllis Davidson in the 1980s. This theory suggests that people believe that others are more affected by media messages than they themselves are. So I might have an almost hypodermic perception of how someone else sees media. So that I might assume that when they look at that, they take things in uncritically, but I don't. So what Davidson is arguing is that's how all of us see each other, that we perceive ourselves to be more critical of the content that we're taking in than other people are. So we tend to think very highly of our own ability to assess media. And when, as we see in this infographic, where it says, this will never affect my own judgment, but it affects other people. So we often see ourselves as outside of being affected by media, and we recognize that it impacts other people. So there's a kind of disconnect. One thing that's really interesting about this is the ways that we interact with media ourselves, how we might perceive our own ability to understand media in relationship to other people. This is a lot of how people talk about each other, right? That everyone else is being brainwashed, or there's an easy assumption that some people are perceiving in one way versus other people because they are more susceptible to media, right? Now we're going to turn to another school of thought, cultural studies research. Cultural studies research approaches a focus on how people make meaning, how they apprehend reality, and articulate values in order to experience those through the use of cultural symbols. One of the reasons that cultural studies grows out of media effects is because people are frustrated with what media effects research has to offer. And many scholars didn't find it particularly insightful. As media effects research is primarily framed around social science and psychology, it had a fairly limited approach, and some researchers wanted to think about things more in terms of philosophy or culture. And so these scholars would argue then that we should be asking more questions about institutions, but also thinking more about how people make meaning and how they understand reality and order their experience through the media and the symbols that they consume. One foundational group to the development of cultural studies is the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School grew initially in the 1920s in the Weimar period in Germany between the First and Second World War, out of a small institute, Goethe Institute at Frankfurt University in Germany. The major thinkers of the Frankfurt School are Horkheimer, Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, and Leo Lowenthal. And they identified three specific inadequacies with most of the media research that they had seen at that point. The first was that it was too reductive of cultural phenomenon. And so it didn't take the way that we relate to culture as significant as the systems that produced it or other aspects, the ideology inside of it, the content that it was trying to sell. It was also too dependent on neutrality and objectivity because it had grown primarily out of social sciences. And again, it wasn't looking at how people really have very subjective experiences and how they relate to media. Finally, it lacked context. In other words, it did not look at the broader historical, socioeconomic contexts in which media is both made and consumed. So they weren't necessarily against media effects. They just wanted to broaden the range of how we might think about media and study it. They were also critiqued for, if we think back to that first week, the way that people have organized culture in terms of high and low and assumed that there's a hierarchical value and that some culture is good and high and some culture is low and bad. The Frankfurt School was particularly snobby. And so, for instance, elevated things like classical music versus jazz or more popular genres. Critical theory approach to media, which grows to some extent out of the Frankfurt School but distinguishes itself by other theorists, is interested in an interpretive approach. So it traditionally draws on historical methods and qualitative ones rather than quantitative ones. So we're less interested in statistics here and instead interested in hearing from people in more open-ended ways and also doing an analysis of the content of the media itself in a deep way. Context and history are super important. Meaning, values, experiences, rituals, etc. are all a big part of how we understand our relationship to media and the narratives that it constructs. Power, class, gender, race, sexuality, etc., are all important within relationship to societal norms and hegemony. There's an investment in looking at how subordinated groups experience their relationship to media. So we're not just interested in quantifiable, generalizable facts because we recognize that it leaves people out. So this forward research emphasizes these understandings of how systems of power work. And we do more interviews, ethnography, etc. A foundational early theorist in cultural studies approaches to communication is a scholar named James Carey, who thought about communication as a form of culture. So this is counter to the transmission view of media effects that we see when we think about the hypodermic needle model. Carey instead argues that media has a message, sure, but what really matters is the way that we interact with and around it with other people. That communication then becomes a cultural practice, a symbolic process where reality is produced, maintained, repaired, and even transformed. So, through engaging with media and having these kinds of ritualized interactions with media and with other people around media, we build meaning. And so, an example here is this way that TGIT sort of became a really significant thing on Twitter. People would take to Twitter to talk about what had been on television. And so, there's a suddenly like a whole different way that people are relating to media that expresses something about its value in social construction and these processes and rituals of meaning making that happen between people, not just people receiving meaning from the media. Another way to think about this might be the rise of TikTok during COVID and the significance that we saw in how that performed new rituals and new ways of meaning making and building culture amongst ourselves in relationship to a media object. One of the most formative cultural studies theories has been a theory developed by Stuart Hall called encoding and decoding theory. So, encoding and decoding theories as a theory of communication suggests that audiences are really active and they read media texts and don't just accept them passively. So, this is a pretty big departure from media effects theory. Hall's theory suggests that readers or audiences are actively constructing their own meanings of media, regardless of what the intended meaning of the media would have been. He suggests that audiences interpret media texts according to their own cultural background and experiences. And so we need to take those into account when we study media. Encoding is the process by which a text is constructed by producers. So you could think of that as like the code being written into the media of what it is that the producer is trying to say. So this captures all of the things that the media is intending to impart to us. And then that fits in with a lot of the things we've maybe already talked about in media effects. But decoding is where the audience piece comes in a really different way, where the audience reads, understands, and interprets the media in a different way than maybe it was even intended. So, in this encoding and decoding theory, Hall suggested that media texts are read in three ways: either dominant or preferred reading, in other words, the way that the producer would like you to read it; Negotiated reading is when an audience interprets the text in their own unique way, but it might not be the way that the person who produced the media would want them to, but it isn't necessarily in opposition either. And this is when an audience completely rejects that text and the message internalized in it. So they might understand the message that they're supposed to get. They don't buy it, they don't believe it. And so this theory is really trying to take account for both pieces of the ways that media is constructed and also the ways that it's understood and interpreted and used to make meaning. And we can see a good evidence of this, right? If we think back to PR and we think about the Pepsi ad that was done with Kendall Jenner, and the fact that the expectation of how that would be understood was very much not how it was read. We could say that was a mostly resistant, mostly oppositional read to that media. Very opposite of what the intentions of the encoding process was hoping would happen in a decoding process. So we can do the same thing with the media that we've looked at, media effects, and these two different advertisements. If we go back to the Colin Kaepernick Nike ad, and we use encoding and decoding theory, we can see some different things about this ad. So thinking about what the people who created this ad might want us to think, I think a lot of the same things that we saw in the media effects theory applies, right? Like we said, this doesn't necessarily shift us that drastically on the production end. It's really the reception end that changes in an encoding and decoding theory of media. So it's still about belief and sacrifice and standing up and associating Nike with that, with all of those things. And so I think we can safely say that is what Nike wanted. Nike wanted us to have good feelings about that suggestion and associate those good feelings with Nike. And that's the sort of inspirational model, right? So the decoding is where we might get to see some different things. So the dominant interpretation is that we would agree with that. We would see this as a representation of inspiration that we would associate with Nike. A negotiated decoding might be that I see Nike wants me to be inspired by this. But maybe I'm a little bit skeptical. Maybe I'm worried that they're just using Colin Kaepernick's activism to make money. And so I maybe even think that it's good that they featured Colin Kaepernick and that they support his support of the movement for Black lives against police brutality. But maybe I'm not sold on it being a corporate ad, or maybe I don't have a problem with that necessarily, but maybe I have concerns about an athlete that we see, right? There might be a number of different kinds of ways that a negotiated response would work, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I have an oppositional response. I might just have some doubts or questions about how to think about this, right? And then so if we were to see a resistance decoding, this might be where I flatly disagree. I think that this is a terrible ad. I think that it's not inspirational. I don't think that Nike should have featured this person. Or I think that maybe it's not that I don't support Colin Kaepernick as the subject of the ad. Maybe it's that I don't think that ads have a right to take control of social actions and political movements. Maybe I find that to be particularly problematic. But at any rate, I'm unhappy with this. The most obvious oppositional decoding would be the number of people who bought Nike products or who burned the Nike products that they already had in response, right? That's an oppositional read. A dominant read is I feel so associated with this ad that I'm going to go buy the sneakers or I'm going to go buy products because I want them to continue to support Colin Kaepernick. And I believe that their support is real and sincere. A negotiated read might be that I just don't participate in some way. My skepticism prevents me from responding to this in any particular way. Or maybe I speak about it on social media in a way that's about its kind of complexities, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Okay, so if we go to our next ad then, if we return to the Beachbody ad, and we think about this again in terms of encoding, I think we understand that what's supposed to be happening here is I'm supposed to associate this woman's body with this product, whether that's because I'm trying to look like her or I'm trying to date her. At any rate, I'm supposed to associate this body with this product and then move towards buying that product in an attempt to produce this reality that I'm looking at here in some way or another. So that's what they're going for on the encoding end. Again, not very different from media effects. So the dominant or preferred reading of this text, like we said, would be that I agree with that and I'm inspired by this ad and I want to buy the protein and I want to go to a gym and I don't know, I want to buy a yellow bikini, whatever. So then what's a negotiated response? A negotiated response would be, so maybe I see this ad and I'm not inspired, or maybe I just might not care that much. An oppositional or resistant reading of this text, on the other hand, would be when somebody completely rejects the message of this ad. And so that would be what we see when somebody's saying that it's offensive, it's not appropriate, why is this in the subway? It would be if somebody's saying, not only does this not motivate me, but it makes me feel really bad about myself. I'm also maybe concerned about the health and safety of the model, whatever. And also I'm critical of the kinds of things that it's suggesting about fitness, etc. So we see a lot of people having really oppositional responses to this ad in particular. So there's some great examples of this. There were people who were tactically resisting these ads. There's a series of other ads. You see the one that was highlighting up in the left-hand corner. I guess maybe you're right. I can't remember. It's this one. Sorry, I can't tell left from right on these recordings. So that was part of this series as well. It wasn't only women. This was the man that was presented in those ads as well. And people obviously altered the ad and removed some of the text to shift the meaning. But then you see people creating different ads or responding to this ad in social media. You saw people eating food in front of the ads, like, I'm happy as I am, thanks very much. You saw somebody really pushing back against it, standing in front of it, giving the finger. And then people made these alternative ads here that suggested that maybe everybody has a beach body already if they're a body on a beach. So there is a lot of different ways that this was responded to that were super oppositional and definitely not the intention of the encoding process. Okay, so finally we hit our last section. So political economy approaches to media. And political economy and cultural studies have a long history of being oppositional to some extent. Political economy was primarily interested initially in large scale economic interests, political power, and how that power is used. And so it had a tendency to not be particularly interested in how audiences were responding in ways that could be perceived to be more individual because it was interested in this really wide view. But despite this history of having been a tension between political economy and cultural studies, they're really much more aligned now, and people tend to work across both methods in the way that they do their research now. Political economy is interested in how forces that shape media, whether corporate or government, promote dominant ideologies. Again, so we're seeing more interest in how hegemony is constructed through media and how it relates to, responds, and maybe even produces different forms of social stratification, and that some have more freedom to access and express through media and have a better chance of being heard, and that it's money that determines that access. Political economy approaches came out of the thinking of Karl Marx and other theorists who were interested in how media ownership and its privatization in particular affected the media and the ways that then affected audiences to some extent. Political economy approaches and cultural studies approaches are often concerned with similar things, but approach them in slightly different ways, as we already said. So perhaps other than Marx, one of the most significant figures in political economy and also what then becomes termed as media ecology is Marshall McLuhan. Marshall McLuhan is famous for coining the phrase, the medium is the message. So in other words, you can't really separate the content from the form of the media or how it gets to you. So if I might think that I'm engaging with a form of media that the content feels appropriate to me, it's something I agree with, it might even be something that I'm using in a negotiated way. Or if we go back to uses and gratifications theory, I might be having a relationship with that media that I understand to be different from the intentions of the producer. McLuhan is arguing, though, that even in that context, I can't separate that media from who produced it. I can't separate the content. So the message and the process are all one and the same. So we can't have this separation between the production side and the reception side, that they're all wedded together in some way. And so political economy approaches are really concerned with the media or the channel or the technology in the media and how it reaches us. And Marshall McLuhan also proposed that media influence the progression of society and that significant periods of time or growth can be categorized by the rise of specific technologies during that period. And he also suggests that in different eras that we've looked at throughout this course, there were certain technologies that shaped everything else going on in society around them. A critique of political economy approaches, especially the media ecology model, is that they tend to be very tech deterministic, meaning that the technology determines a lot, that they privilege the technology and its impact, and they don't really leave room for social or individual interpretation or resistance. Okay, so if we do our last run through of these two ads and we think about them through the political economy model, then we can think about other insights that political economy might give us for thinking through these ads. So what's interesting is that because of the ways that political economy thinks about media, what is in the ad is less relevant in a lot of ways than how this ad circulates. Political economists might be really critical of this ad because they would see that it was a company, a private company, trying to use a political movement or a type of social activism for their own profit and glomming onto that. And so in a political economy analysis, they would be very concerned about what we would call the commodification of a social movement for a company's own profits. And that would be a huge critique of political economy that they would have for this ad. Another critique might be that they would make this ad features a Black athlete who has been widely outspoken, but has not actually been supported by the NFL, and that Nike sponsors many other athletes in the NFL, and that Rather than featuring him in an ad, they could easily have put pressure on the NFL as a significant sponsor in order to shift practices of the NFL. And that's not something they did because they were primarily interested in attaching themselves as a company to this event. And so these are the types of critiques that a political economy approach might have. And so if we think about this in relationship with, say, Stuart Hall encoded, decoded, and negotiated, here's a response from someone on Twitter that is a political economy analysis from a negotiated response from somebody who had an issue with the app, right? So rad Nike's backing Colin Kaepernick, but I wish they'd also backed the garment workers of color that they exploit in their sweatshops because they also exist. And backing dope people doesn't justify your violence abroad. If we pro justice for people of color, let's not be exclusive, right? So this is a very political economy read of the ad where it's bringing the focus back to the power of the company and its economic position in the world and what it's doing in its production of this ad. If we go back to the Beachbody Ready ad again, a political economy approach to this would also be thinking about where this ad was circulating and how it appeared. So again, we see it in social media, we see it in public spaces. So that's going to impact the ways that people interact with it. Again, we have a lot of the same reception interests, right? Another critique that political economists might raise about this ad is the kind of broader structural issues with women in media. So it might be interested in the fact that women's bodies are used to sell things in media in a particular way as a way of making money off of people's insecurities, also then functions to produce other effects in society culturally and depends upon an entire network of systems of the production of social meaning and insecurity that then the ad can respond to. So that might be one way that they think about it. Another way might be that they would actually do an analysis of the product itself, similar to the way that we thought about Nike's production of its product as not being directly talked about in the ad itself and being hidden. A political economy response to this then might also be to look at the product itself, how it's created. Finally, to wrap up a little for the week, we're going to look at an analogy of all of these things together. So I saw this iconographic and I thought it was really helpful. In this image, we're posed the question, so you hear that your friend had an argument with the teacher, and it puts you through different media studies models. So in a political economy approach, we're going to be able to understand why a teacher might have said something in a conversation. What is the context? What is the power structure that holds that teacher up in a particular way and allows them to do that? A cultural studies approach would be to understand how they were arguing, what were the terms on which they were basing their arguments. And in an effects tradition, we're going to understand that, like, what happened? What happened as a result of that interaction? This is just a really quick way of doing this. I wanted to point out that I'm not going through all of the different methodologies that get used in these different practices. We talked a little bit about qualitative versus quantitative, and your book goes into much greater detail about this. And the thing is, some of you have already done this, right? Where you've done a mix of building survey type data, even though at a very small scale, but then also asking people why they felt the way they felt about things or making conclusions about that. So you've already been engaging with a lot of the practices, but you can see them spelled out much more clearly in your book. In conclusion, I just want to emphasize that the different theories of media help us think about the ways that media impacts us and the ways that we engage with media. And new theories of how to study media will always arise with new media technologies. And many of these foundational theories continue to impact current media research, right? So there's new things that come up as new media models and new technologies come up, but we tend to still often use some of the older things, and they inform the newer things. Also, the way that we relate to media changes with each new technology, so we need new theories for thinking about it. And there is no one way or right way to study media. I hope everybody has a really good week. Take care.